The bass guitar is the most basic of all guitars, but in the right hands, it's capable of producing funky bass lines, deadly deep breakdowns, and even killer solos. However, in your hands, the bass creates nothing but low-pitched noise that your neighbors can both hear and feel as it rumbles and shakes their walls and rattles their chests. I'm not gonna lie, I love the sound of a bass, bass, bass. You, on the other hand, love the bass not so much for its sound, but because it has less strings and bigger frets than a real guitar. There are no chords to memorize and generally no solos to learn. You can just finger your way through songs one note at a time with a big goofy smile on your face because technically doing so makes you a musician. But while playing the bass might technically make you a musician, which bass you play makes you who you are as a person. You might think you chose your instrument from the tiny, isolated bass room and guitar center all the way in the back past the real guitars, but you didn't. It chose you, and it tells us everything we don't want to know about you. Let's see what your bass guitar says about you. Number 1. Fender Precision Bass, aka P-Bass. For years, I'd only heard this instrument referred to as a P-Bass. Naturally, I assumed the P stood for either plain or pedestrian because this bass is both boring and unimaginative, just like its owners. You wanted a professional-looking instrument that's made by one of the only 2 brands you've ever heard of. Gibson basses were out of your price range, so you narrowed it down to either a Fender Jazz Bass or a P-Bass. Since you don't play jazz, and like me, you didn't know what the P stood for and incorrectly assumed it meant popular because you've seen people like Sting playing one, or the guy from The Clash famously making his clash with the stage, you bought a Fender P-Bass. Now, you and I both know that the P in P-Bass stands for precision. Maybe someday you'll learn to play a song precisely as written, and your bass will live up to its name. But until that day comes, your P-Bass is really more of an I-Bass, because your playing is imprecise and your fingering is incorrect. But at least you're using your fingers. Your playing might sound like shit, but you look a hell of a lot cooler than you would if you were playing with a pick. Unless you're trying to learn the solo to Maxwell Murder, there's no reason for a bass player to ever pick up a guitar pick. Bassists who use a pick get picked on because it paints the picture that they only picked up the bass because they thought learning to play it would be a picnic. As you've learned, becoming a proficient finger-picking bass player requires practice, persistence, and patience. It's not nearly as easy as it looks. But you're committed to learning to play without a pick because you know it'll make you look cooler in pictures. And although your bass's pickups aren't anything special, what your P-Bass lacks in sound, it more than makes up for with history. For more than 70 years, players from Steve Harris to Sting, James Jamerson to George Porter Jr. have rocked a Fender P-Bass. And although you're not nearly as talented as any of them, every time you pick up your Fender P-Bass, you feel precisely like a fucking rock star. Number 2, Fender Jazz Bass, aka J-Bass. Don't let the name fool you. Jazz isn't the only genre of music you can play badly with this instrument. It's capable of making terrible rock, funk, and country too. But you already knew that, which is why you bought a J-Bass. You thought it would make you look like a sophisticated musician, since most jazz is too sophisticated for you to enjoy, let alone play. However, when I see you playing rock with your jazz bass, I don't see a sophisticated musician. I see a dude who somehow managed to make 2 completely different genres of music look bad at the same time. Unlike the P-Bass, which has more of a Stratocaster-like body, the J-Bass has an asymmetrical, offset body. And if you watch my video about electric guitars, you know how awesome I think offset guitars are at being awful. Like their 6-stringed offset counterparts, the Fender J-Bass has a weird-shaped body, bad pickups, and more knobs than you know what to do with. In other words, more than 2. And since it has smaller frets and a thinner neck than the P-Bass, it's easier to play. Badly. You probably saw a J-Bass in the hands of exceptionally skilled musicians like Geddy Lee or Jaco Pastorius and thought, that's the bass for me. I want to sound like those guys. But since even the first few measures of YYZ gave you trouble, it's going to be a long time before you do. However, now that you've got a J-Bass like John Paul Jones and Geddy Lee, you're 1% closer to sounding like them. Just 99% to go. So, for the time being, you'll have to settle for looking like them. Number 3, Gibson Thunderbird. Gibson didn't start making bass guitars until 12 years after Fender released its precision bass. You'd think that with 12 extra years of design time, they would have come up with a vastly superior instrument. But Instead of letting a skilled musical craftsman like Leo Fender design their first bass, Gibson outsourced the job to some dude who designed cars for a living. And apparently, they let him name it too, because Thunderbird's also the name of a sports car. But the Gibson Thunderbird and the Ford Thunderbird have a lot more in common than just their name. They're both way overpriced, both have unimaginative body designs, and both have dozens of less expensive, better performing, more aesthetic alternatives. Despite all that, you bought a Gibson Thunderbird because... honestly, I have no fucking idea why you bought it. Maybe you just wanted to own a Gibson, or you saw the ridiculously high price tag and assumed it must be a good bass guitar. Just like I assume you must not know very much about bass guitars if you bought a Gibson Thunderbird. The Thunderbird is a great option for bassists who don't want to draw a lot of attention to themselves. Not only is this instrument so plain looking and sounding that it draws neither the eye nor the ear, it's so fucking heavy that unless you're some 7-foot-tall giant like Chris Novoselic, you can't possibly move around while playing it. So, if you're eager to get up on stage, but you don't want anybody paying any attention to you while you're up there, the Gibson Thunderbird is a solid option. And, as a Thunderbird player, you're in good company. There are plenty of unremarkable musicians in awesome bands who play them. Take System of a Down, for example, one of my all-time favorites. I didn't even know they had a fucking bass player until the first time I saw him play live, and even then I didn't notice the guy till like halfway through their set. But sure enough, they do have a bass player, and he plays the same overpriced piece of shit as you. But what if you can't afford a Gibson Thunderbird, or a Gibson anything else, and you're a big Motley Crue fan who wants to look like his favorite glammed-out rocker, Nikki Sixx? Good news, for 6 times less than a Gibson Thunderbird, there's another option, and it's only 5 times shittier. Number 4. Epiphone Thunderbird. Nothing says, I wish I owned a Gibson, like owning an Epiphone. It's like if I offered you either a big piece of delicious chocolate cake, or a big piece of shit that looks exactly like the cake. If they were both the same price, you'd pick the cake 100% of the time. That's because nobody wants to eat shit. Just like no one wants to own an Epiphone Thunderbird because it's a shittier version of an already shitty bass guitar. Unlike Gibson Thunderbirds, which are made in the United States, Epiphones come from China, just like iPhones and TikTok, which is fitting because instead of spending time practicing their instrument, Epiphone owners spend all day and night on their phones, bitching and whining that the guy with the ugly beard on TikTok said mean things about their precious little guitar because they don't understand what satire is. Just like they don't know what it's like to play a real instrument. What the Epiphone Thunderbird lacks in sound, look, and feel, it more than makes up for with price, which, let's be real, is why you bought one. If you could afford a Gibson, you'd own a Gibson. But you can't, so you don't. Instead, you bought what looks like a Gibson, but is made from cheaper parts and much cheaper labor. But just because your Epiphone Thunderbird was made by children slaving away in some unair-conditioned Chinese factory doesn't mean you'll be slaving away at learning how to play the thing well. You're happy to settle for being just good enough to get by. Just like you pretend to be happy to own an Epiphone Thunderbird and not a real one. Number 5. Any fretless bass. This nightmare of an instrument only sounds good in the hands of the best of bassists. So I don't know why the fuck you bought one. You can't even play the right notes on a regular fretted bass. Now I have to listen to you playing shit wrong and 50 cents out of tune. A fretless bass is exactly what it sounds like. A bass guitar, but without those pesky little markers that tell you exactly where to push down for each note. You know, the things that make it a guitar. It is supposed to be a bass guitar. Not a violin, not a fucking cello, a bass guitar. So why the fuck would you take the easiest instrument imaginable and make it way harder to play by removing all its frets? Fretless bass is basically bass guitar on hard mode for no reason. And since you chose the bass because it's basically regular guitar on easy mode, buying a fretless bass made no sense whatsoever. But don't fret. You might not be able to play your fretless bass in tune, but neither can anyone else. So, when you're constantly fucking up song after song at band practice, you can just blame it on the bass. Then, when the guitar player takes your bass to try to show you the right way to play, he can't play the thing in tune either. Even though, like all decent guitar players, he can play any normal bass with ease. So he buys your bullshit story about how it's the bass's fault that you suck, and not because you spent exactly as many hours practicing as your bass has frets. I can only think of 2 possible reasons why you or anyone else would ever want a fretless bass. Either your band is doing a cover of the Humpty Dance, which, unless your band's singer's body has been inhabited by the spirit of Shock G, is going to suck. Or you saw Les Claypool playing My Name is Mud with one, and since he makes it look easy, you incorrectly assume it'd be easy to play. You might not yet be at a level where you can play My Name is Mud, but you sure can muddy up your band's sound by playing every note 50 cents off key. Number 6. Hofner Violin Bass. If you're the type of person who likes cars that look like trucks or dogs that look like rats possessed by Satan, you might be the type of person who would like a bass that looks like a violin. I'm talking, of course, about the Hofner Violin Bass. While the fretless bass just takes a regular bass guitar and makes it way harder to play, the violin bass takes a regular bass guitar and just makes it look stupid. Ironically, violins don't have frets, but violin bass guitars do. What they don't have is coolness. Not anymore, anyway. Sometimes called the Beatle bass because Paul McCartney played one, the violin bass might have been cool for about 5 minutes back in the 1960s. Just like how those ridiculously ugly handlebar mustaches you sometimes see guys with might have been cool way back in the wild, wild west. The violin bass is to regular basses what the handlebar mustache is to regular mustaches. Like most basses, most mustaches aren't that cool to begin with. And those stupid handlebar mustaches you sometimes see dudes with, like violin basses, might have looked cool on 1 or 2 dudes decades ago, but today they just look ridiculous. The only reason why guys sport handlebar mustaches is so that when women catch them staring at their tits, they can play it off like, "Oh no, I wasn't looking at your breast, I was just looking at my stupid fucking mustache. Just making sure my ridiculous mustache was still there." No one's buying your little bullshit mustache story. Just like no self-respecting musician is buying a violin bass. Number 7. Rickenbacker 4000 series basses. When you think of Rickenbacker basses, you probably picture them in the hands of awesome musicians like Cliff Burton, Lemmy Kilmister, and Roger Waters, which is why these basses often find themselves in the hands of novice players like yourself. You bought a Rickenbacker as your first bass because you wanted to rock out like the greats. But you won't be rocking out until you can figure out where to be plugging in. Rickenbacker 4000 series basses have not one output like every other bass on the planet, but 2. This bizarre dual output is called a Ricka sound, which is ironic because you haven't been able to get your bass to make a single sound since you bought it. Between the 2 outputs, the 4 knobs, and the 1 switch, you haven't been able to figure out a combo of knob turns and switch positions that produce anything more than confusion. You're so distracted by your bass's chaotic design that even though you plugged it into 2 different combo amps, you forgot to plug them into the wall. You're further confused by your Rickenbacker's pickups because you're too lazy to pick up the 8-page owner's manual that came with the instrument, a manual that's 7.5 pages longer than that of any other bass. The only thing you've been able to figure out about your Rickenbacker's horseshoe pickup is that it definitely doesn't bring you good luck. But if you someday do figure out how to get sound to come out of your bass, between the pickups and switches, you'll be able to hear your bad playing in a variety of punchy tones. Number 8. Schecter Stilettos, Ibanez SRs, and similar basses. I'm lumping these types of bass guitars together because they basically look the same, sound the same, and are bought for the same reason: to play loud, fast, heavy music. These instruments are built for performance, affordability, and to piss off the poor bastards who live in the apartments above, below, and next door to you. And it would piss off your now ex-girlfriend, but she left a week ago because she got sick of watching all her priceless knickknacks get destroyed as the rumbling of your 16th notes sent them vibrating off the shelves, smashing down to the floor. But you're happy that your girlfriend left, because all the time that you were wasting fingering her was time that you could have spent fingering your lightweight, high-performance, active pickup bass. So, now that your overweight, high-maintenance, passive-aggressive girl is gone, you've got plenty of time to practice your metal band songs so you can kill it in the studio when it comes time to record them. Even though, since it's metal and no one really gives a shit about the bass, the mixing engineer is going to cut 20 decibels from your track and add 20 to all 20 guitar tracks. But you don't care that no one can hear you on the master. You know your bass playing is somewhere in there, buried underneath the growling vocals, layered guitars, and thumping drums. And that's really the best any metal bassist can hope for. Rest assured, you're in good company. I can name lots of bass players in popular metal bands I've seen over the years playing a Schecter, an Ibanez, or something similar. There's the dude from Killswitch Engage, the dude from Avenged Sevenfold, the dude from Power Man 5000. Okay, so I don't know a single metal bassist who plays a Schecter or an Ibanez 4-string by name, and neither does anybody else except maybe other metal bassists. But even though I can't hear their playing over the other instruments, I know they're there. And being some nameless bass player in a metal band is good enough for you. We both know you'll never learn to play an instrument with 6 or more strings. But maybe someday you'll make the leap to a 5-string bass. Maybe then I'll learn your name. But still, probably not. Number 9, 5-string bass. Now that it's been a couple weeks since your girlfriend walked out to the sound of you playing a walking bass line, you're feeling really lonely and low. But instead of going out and looking for a new girl to pick you back up, you go to Guitar Center to look for a new bass that will get you lower than ever before. B2 low, to be exact. And that is when you spot her. She's the sexiest thing you've ever laid eyes on. So you walk right up to her and without saying a word, start fingering her right in the middle of the store. You are in love. You know this one will never walk out on you. Because she can't. Because she's a bass guitar. A 5-string bass guitar. So you clumsily finger her, slapping her around a little bit, and she takes it like a champ. You just can't get enough of that low B string. That's because you keep hitting it by accident while trying to play songs that go no lower than E. After manhandling your bass to B for a while, and even though it's your first date, whispering into her pickups that you love her, you're ready to buy. Though 5 Guitar Center employees asked you if you needed anything during the 5-second walk to the bass room, now that you're ready to buy, you can't find a single fucking one. So, you wander around the store, looking for an employee who's not too busy playing one of the instruments to actually do their job. 5 minutes later, you finally find somebody to ring up your 5-string bass and the 5 other items that you didn't really need, but they convinced you to buy. Unlike 4-string metal bassists, I can actually name some 5-string players. There's Fieldy from Korn, there's the dude from Trivium. Okay, so unless the dude from Trivium's name is actually Dude from Trivium, I can only name one, Fieldy. But it doesn't really matter, because even if I could name 100 5-string metal bassists, you wouldn't be able to hear the name of a single one over the sound of the low B string you keep hitting by accident. Number 10, Fodera basses. If you had tens of millions of dollars laying around, I wouldn't blame you for buying a Lamborghini. But if you had to save and save just to put a down payment on one, I'd think you were a fucking idiot. I feel no differently about Fodera bass guitars. If you've got tons of money and want a high-end, American-made bass that'll make you look like Victor Wooten, get yourself a Fodera. Just don't think you're going to sound like him. In the hands of a skilled player, a Fodera bass sounds amazing. Unfortunately, most of these instruments don't find themselves into the hands of skilled players, only wealthy ones, or worse, the children of wealthy parents. Your parents might own millions in investments, but you'll never get good at playing your Fodera bass that they bought you for fucking Labor Day unless you invest thousands of hours into practicing it. And the only thing you invest time into laboring away at is getting your ass kicked at Call of Duty. Fodera basses look, sound, and feel amazing. Or so I've heard. Only. Because, since I'm far too poor to be able to afford one, I've never actually seen or touched a Fodera bass in person. But I have heard people like Victor Wooten playing them in videos. To be honest, before I'd ever heard Victor, I didn't even know you could use the words bass guitar and virtuoso in the same sentence. I had heard bass guitar and virtually worthless and virtueless instrument plenty of times, but Victor Wooten taught me that the bass guitar in the right hands can be almost as cool as a regular guitar. Just like you taught me that even the most expensive, highest quality basses still sound like shit in hands like yours. And now, you know what your bass guitar says about you. Do you play one of the basses I mentioned? Something else? Tell me about your bass and the shitty music you play with it in the comment section below.
You're so annoying.
If you want to hear some of my shitty music, which includes me playing my 5-string Ibanez, click the link in the description or search for this dude on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever else you usually listen to shitty music. Mustache.